Hi, I'm sorry. Thanks.
Fine. Welcome.
That always gets me, the trouble with the Zoom link.
Yeah.
Always like
It's
last minute panic mode.
it's a steep learning curve for all of us. You're just fine.
Yeah. I'm just gonna pull up my presentation. I think I'm gonna do something with all these lights too.
Okay, are you able to share your screen?
I
want to make sure you have the right settings on.
Hold on a sec.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, it says it's disabled. The participant screen sharing is disabled, it says.
I'll jump in there. Maybe if I make you co-host, that'll let you. Let's try it.
Okay, I actually just changed the settings now that you made me a co-host. Now I can share it.
Oh, good. Great. Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone. I'm actually commuting by bike home from teaching for today, so I stopped by a park, so I wouldn't be home with my noisy kids.
Okay, cool. I'm just gonna, so you can see the screen. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm actually gonna make a last minute change to this.
And I have some questions. So I don't know, we have not spoken directly, but I'm the director at Bike Walk Provo and organize this. I'm Mary. Nice to meet you, Angie. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I do have some questions to ask you. Should we plan on that maybe at the end and then taking any questions from the attendees after your presentation?
Yeah, that's what you guys want me to talk for half hour and do Q&A for an hour. Is that right? Or a half hour?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that sounds fine.
Perfect.
Okay. Cool. And then, so people are going to start coming on in 1 minute?
Yeah. It looks like we actually do have the attendees joining us. It's the same link. So we have a number here. Oh, 26 attendees. And also a couple other panelists. And any of our attendees, I'm sorry, I lost track of this a little bit, but if you were meant to be a panelist on this, please just message me and I'll make sure that we change you to be a panelist.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So I'll be watching the questions, Mary, and should I just send them to you like in the chat?
Yes, that would be great. Angie, how do you feel about interruptions to your, I know you've probably done this before, so interruptions to your presentation, or just take all the questions at the end?
For questions?
Mm-hmm.
Either way.
I would suggest at the end.
Okay.
I mean, Angie, I've seen your presentation and it's really good how it is. Like, I would hate for people to interrupt it.
Okay. Sure.
That sounds great. Thank you, Austin.
Yeah. So how many people do we have on?
Right now we're up to 35. 37, 40. Okay, I think people are coming in quickly now as it's 4:01. We've lost you there, Angie. Oh,
I'm here.
there you are.
I don't know. Are you guys gonna do a little spiel at the beginning about your organization? Okay, so maybe I'll just turn off my camera instead of just sort of sitting there doing that.
Right, and sorry, I see a hand raised from somebody, and I'm trying to work this out from my from my phone. Give me just a moment. Sorry. Carrie, I saw that you had your hand raised. I just marked allowed to talk. Do you want to just go ahead and ask? Carrie O'Neill.
No, I'm good. Thank you so much.
Okay, just want to make sure
Thanks
we're
so much.
missing something important. Thanks. All right. Sorry, give this just another like 30 seconds. Okay, we are up to 65 participants and it's 4:04. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming. We're really excited about this webinar. I'm going to say one more time in case there was any stragglers. If you were meant to be a panelist, please just message the panelists and we'll get that changed for you. All right, so my name is Mary Wade. I'm the director of Bike Walk Provo, and I'm actually at a park on my way home, biking home from work, so I can have a quiet time to listen to Angie. We're really excited to have Angie present to us. She is, I'm totally going off of your Amazon bio, Angie. I hope that's okay. Angie is one of the country's best known writers and experts on the topic of sustainable transportation. She was the longtime national editor at Streets Blog. Her writing and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Public Radio. She is the founder and principal at 3MPH Planning and Consulting, a small firm focused on pedestrian safety. She lives in Cleveland with her husband and 2 children. So with that, we'll go ahead and have Angie do her presentation. We will follow that with a Q&A from our attendees.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Let me just pull up this presentation. This is always a little bit awkward, but here we go. I should be used to this by now. I've been traveling around the country giving this presentation, well, virtually traveling around the country. So, so here we go. And it's basically, I'm just outlining some of the key points in my book. It's called Right of Way. And it's about, when people ask me what it's about, my sort of elevator pitch is that it's about the pedestrian safety crisis in America. So this presentation attempts to explain that and why it's happening. So just real quickly, an overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the issue, who is getting killed, where they're getting killed, and then there's a big section that's just about cars, because car design factors into this a lot, and I'm really interested in cars. And last, I'll talk a little bit about solutions. Okay, so I don't know how many of you with Bike Provo know this, but you know, here's a photo of Cleveland where I live back in 1930. And this is sort of before the auto age, or the auto age is just beginning at this time. You can see there are a few cars along the street here. This is right in the middle of downtown. And notice that there's really no crosswalks. Pedestrians sort of have free roam of the street. And notice how relaxed they look crossing the street. So streets used to be places in cities of all kinds of various activities. They were places where kids played, merchants would sell things from carts, but all of that changed around this period. There's a guy named Peter Norton, probably a lot of you have heard of him. He wrote a really interesting book about this. It's called Fighting Traffic. He's a historian, and he says that during this period, most Americans think of the adoption of automobiles as sort of this frictionless love affair with the car. But when cars first came into American cities in a big way in the 30s after the introduction of the Model T, it was actually very controversial. A lot of people started dying almost immediately, and disproportionately they were children. So there was a lot of outcry in the media. People were getting organized, especially groups of mothers, under the umbrella of the National Safety Council. So this was always very threatening to the emerging auto industry and associated industries like gasoline sellers. So they introduced around this period the concept of jaywalking. They thought up the idea of jaywalking, this idea that pedestrians should only be allowed to cross at crosswalks, and even then only when basically there wasn't any car traffic. And they used propaganda like this. This is, again, Peter Norton dug this up, a little leaflet that was handed out in Cincinnati in 1952. And you can see like the language sort of blames people if they get hit by cars. So this concept of the jaywalker and jaywalking was, of course, widely adopted and is now part of the law all over the United States. And it really changed the way we think about streets and who has a right to streets. And it changed the way we react when people are killed. Now, often we blame the person who was walking, almost reflexively. So just a few years later, this is a different street in Cleveland. It's nearby though. And this is just 16 years later. You can see one thing that I think is striking about this image compared to the previous one is just the complete absence of people. So now we have this wide right of way, and it's totally for use by drivers. So that's created this situation where pedestrians are pretty marginalized in public space. And this is just an illustration that I think does a nice job of highlighting it. And you see how precarious the situation is for a lot of pedestrians. Okay, so when I talk about the pedestrian safety crisis, this is what I'm talking about. We had a pretty steady decline in the United States since about the 1970s in the number of deaths, and that's pretty typical with traffic safety. We sort of expect to see gradually improving outcomes since the 1970s, and during that time, the first auto safety regulations are being introduced. Seatbelts are not even mandatory, so we would sort of expect improving outcomes. But about 10 years ago, there was this big reversal that started happening with pedestrian deaths, and to some extent with bicyclists as well, a similar pattern. So the first few years this was happening, this is so unexpected and unusual that a lot of folks who are traffic safety experts sort of didn't know what was going on and thought maybe it was just a fluke. But we know now that it is this sustained trend. Okay, so why is this happening? That's what I want to try and explain. So just to start off, I think there's a misconception, sort of a popular misconception in the media. You see this a lot. And I think when people think about who's getting killed while walking, the like stereotypical image that kind of comes to mind is this guy over here on the left. And he's like a very wired millennial and he's crossing at a crosswalk and maybe he's in a major city like DC. And I think that misconception just sort of stems from the privilege of the people who are in influential positions. For example, in media and in government, many of them are relatively wealthy and they drive to work. And this is the kind of thing they see anecdotally. So that's who they assume is being killed. But really, it's more like this guy over here on the right, who's just kind of running for his life on a wide suburban arterial. That's really a better representation. So a little bit more about who's being killed. This is a problem that has a racial element, and it's a little bit like Corona, where you would think it would apply to everyone evenly, but when you dig into the data, it really reflects a lot of the inequality in our society, and obviously racial inequality is enormous. Hispanic folks, Black folks, and Native folks especially are at increased risk. Native people are 4.5 times as likely to be killed while walking as the average person in the United States. So another factor is age. This is a long-term, so there's a long-term disparity. This is not new, but older people are at increased risk for being hit and killed while walking, sort of for obvious reasons. People 75 and older are about twice as likely to be killed as the average person. But one thing I want to point out is this is a very fast growing demographic group. About 1 in 5 Americans are more than 50 now, I believe, and it is expected to grow to 1 in 4 over the next couple decades. So as far back as about 10 years ago, people like the Center for Disease Control predicted that pedestrian deaths would rise just based on this alone. Now, they didn't predict a 50% rise, but they predicted pedestrian deaths might rise as the population aged. And we're really not doing a good enough job planning for this demographic group. So this is a problem that also has a geographic component. And this is Transportation for America produced this nice map as part of their Dangerous by Design biannual report. And it shows the most dangerous states for pedestrians. And it also shows some of the safest. So the most dangerous ones here in purple are almost without exception in the Sun Belt region of the United States. And the reason for that is if you think back to those first couple photos I showed about cities before sort of the dawn of the auto age, cities like Cleveland and, maybe Boston, some of these older cities in the Midwest and the Northeast were pretty fully developed before the introduction of the automobile. And that really changed the way we design streets and cities. And that occurred, there's a big change in paradigm around 1940. So places that developed before 1940 tend to be relatively walkable by the standards of the United States. But places that developed more after the rise of, or after the invention of air conditioning, so post 1940 tend to be the most dangerous. They have wider, faster roads. They may have, cul-de-sacs, a lot of roads that dead end, and that tends to be really bad news for pedestrians. And again, this is, I think a lot of people sort of understand this that have a basic knowledge of the issue, but this I think also helps explain in part why pedestrian deaths have been growing. The Sun Belt region of the United States is almost without exception. These are the fastest growing excuse me, places in the United States. So, Boston is not capturing the lion's share of population growth. It's happening in Dallas and Houston and cities in Florida that are pretty scary to walk in. Okay, so I talked about how this has a racial element. It's tied in with inequality and systemic racism. So I just want to walk you through, there's another geographic phenomenon that I think is contributing to the problem. And I'm going to use Cleveland, where I live, as an example. And this shows racial segregation in Cleveland. Green is racial concentrations, Black people. Orange is sort of segregation, white people. And then these yellow areas show areas that are a little bit more diverse. So I think, like, we've all heard, or most of us have probably heard of this phenomenon, the suburbanization of poverty. And but I think these maps really highlight how big of a change it has been. And again, these are maps of racial change, but they show how the suburbs have sort of been changing. So if we go forward in Cleveland 20 years, you can see how we're still a very segregated region, but it's broken down, and there's more diversity in suburban areas. So this is a national trend, and it's actually more stark in growing metro regions. Cleveland doesn't have a lot of population growth, but what is occurring in a lot of metro regions like Atlanta is that suburbs that were designed for in sort of the segregation era for primarily white families who all had 2-car garages and used a highway to commute every day, those have become a lot more diverse. There's a lot more lower income people that may rely on walking or transit out in locations, again, that are very hostile. So just to sort of make a comparison and tie this back in with racism, systemic racism, this is a map that shows the most dangerous road segments in Cleveland. I just wanted to point out sort of how closely it aligns with that map of racial segregation. Okay, so to go into a little more detail about this is a map. This is the line here. This blue line is a big demographic fault line in Cleveland. It's the border between Cleveland and Shaker Heights. And the important thing to know about it is that this part of Cleveland is almost entirely Black and pretty low income, very low income area. And then Shaker Heights is a higher income suburb, but it's a mixed race suburb, but it's also much wider than this part of Cleveland. So I think you can see sort of the disparity. These dots show crashes that happened at the various degrees of severity. And I think you can see across the border, there's obviously a big difference. So there's probably a few things going on here. Shaker Heights probably designs their streets a little bit different. It's a different policing paradigm. They may have a lower tolerance for speeding and that kind of thing on their residential streets. Again, these are higher income folks. But I think also part of the explanation is just that more people are walking in Cleveland. These folks are doing more walking and doing more transit riding. So they also have just sort of increased risk from that. Okay, so this is something we see across the country, and this is an example I like to use in my presentations. It's from Portland, and I think most of us, we think of Portland as being sort of aspirational on some of this safe, active transportation stuff, and they are in a lot of ways, but they have the same kind of issue here. So here's a map they produced, and it shows fatalities over 2 years, traffic fatalities. And they use the names of the victims, which I think is a nice visualization just to kind of humanize these folks. But you can see that this is not happening in sort of a random pattern. There's definitely a concentration over here on the right side of the map. So again, there's a demographic fault line in Portland, and it's right here. It's East 82nd Street. So east of 82nd Street is called East Portland. And East Portland is poorer and more diverse than the rest of the city. And it's also where traffic deaths are concentrated. About 50% of traffic deaths in Portland occur in East Portland, even though only about a quarter of the population lives there. And you can see this map shows high crash intersections. I don't know how well you can see it, but of the 30 high crash intersections in Portland, 28 are in East Portland. So there's a big disparity in the kind of infrastructure wealthier neighborhoods are receiving and lower income neighborhoods of color are receiving. So just to talk about that a little bit more, this is an image from a study done by the University of Minnesota, and it shows the lands, some tribal lands near a reservation in Minnesota. And on one side of this road, this rural road, is a food cellar. And on the other side is this tribal service center. So we talked earlier, I touched on how high of a risk Native folks are, Indigenous folks in the United States are for being hit and killed by cars while they're walking. And one of the explanations is that tribal lands and reservations, they operate a little bit like urban areas or traditional villages in that there is a good amount of walking that takes place, but they're set in kind of rural locations where there aren't a lot of nice amenities typically. And so people who live in this area, they have to cross this high-speed rural road with no accommodations. You know, there's no crosswalk here, there's no traffic light. They're having to deal with this really fast-moving traffic. And this study is interesting, and I think it gives us sort of insight into how the systemic racism I'm talking about plays out in infrastructure. They went around to a handful of reservations and tribal lands across Minnesota, and they interviewed the residents about this problem. And people who lived on the reservations were saying, this is a huge problem. It was coming up all the time. But when they interviewed the people from the state DOT, it almost never came up. And even when they pressed them, these are the engineers, the people that are empowered to solve the problem, they would sort of revert to behavioral changes. They would sort of emphasize things like drunk walking and that kind of thing that put the sort of onus back on the folks who were being hurt and killed. So I think obviously there's sort of a cultural rift there. That most of the people, these engineers at state DOTs are often white guys, and they just didn't have enough respect for sort of local knowledge in this case. Okay, so I tried at the beginning to kind of warn you guys about this. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and start talking about cars now, because that's a big factor. So we've got more Americans that are more vulnerable because they're getting older. We've got more Americans in more dangerous locations for walking, like suburban areas and the Sun Belt. So that's all contributing to the problem. In the meantime, we have cars getting way more dangerous for pedestrians. And it has to do with the type of cars we're buying in the United States. So there's been this really enormous shift in what Americans are driving in the last few decades, but especially over the last decade. And if you look back to about 2012, when we were coming out of the last recession, about 3 in 4 vehicles being sold in the United States, new vehicles for that model year, were sedans. And now that has effectively reversed, and 3 in 4 vehicles are either sedans or pickups, and are either SUVs or pickups. And sedans are sort of almost kind of like going extinct. So it turns out that's really bad news for pedestrians. This is just an image that I think this is so normalized to us. Most people do not even think about this. But I mean, if you look at these two vehicles, I just wanted you to notice how much bigger this white one is. But it has pretty much identical seating capacity. It may have a little bit of extra cargo room, but it's just a much bigger car. And a lot of the space is sort of like, the extra space is sort of right here in this kind of useless area. But that has a big impact on pedestrian injuries. So I used myself in these photos as for scale. I'm about 5'6", but you can see that like this Honda Civic on the left would hit me sort of like in the knee or thigh or leg area if I was struck. But this car here on the right, this is a Toyota 4Runner. it would strike me sort of like in the chest or the stomach. And that is sort of for obvious reasons is a much worse place to be hit by a car, to have a blunt force trauma. So we know for a fact this is contributing to the problem. As early as 2015, the Federal Highway Administration released a report saying SUVs are about 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill pedestrians. And people have been sounding the alarm about this sort of to deaf ears or sort of being ignored when they said that as early as the late 1990s. Another thing that's going on is pickup trucks have gotten really enormous. And this is an image I use a lot in my presentations, and it appears in my book, but it shows, and this is my son when he was 4 years old in front of, I believe this is a lifted Ford F-250. So as you can see, the front profile on vehicles has gotten really aggressive and sort of violent almost. I think that it's definitely intentional on the auto company's part to make them look very violent. And unfortunately that appeals to a lot of people. And they can charge a lot of money for these very large pickups that look so aggressive. They also create large blind zones in the front and back of the vehicles. There's people that have done experiments where they've sat like 27 kids in this area in front of this kind of car, and all those kids would be completely invisible to the driver. So you see kids this age and younger getting run over at slow speeds in the front and backed over, especially often in their own driveways by their own family members. Quite frequently, it happens about 50 times a week in the United States. So just to walk you through a little bit, because I think the photos really tell the story pretty well, the evolution of cars and how they've become so much more violent looking. So this is on the RAV4 in 1996. And the reason I chose this car is because it's the #1 selling vehicle in the United States, except for pickups. So you can see though, back in 1996, it's this very cute little car. It has this cute little face. It's based on the Corolla, the Toyota Corolla body, which was like a compact sedan for you younger folks. Do they still make that? I can't remember. But anyway, so it's like kind of like a tall Corolla, and it only weighs 2,500 pounds in 1996. So just looking ahead, moving ahead to 2009, you can see it's added about 800 pounds on the light end. So it's gotten a lot heavier. It has sort of a meaner front end. And then just looking ahead to 2019, it's actually not too much heavier than 2009, but look how the front end is sort of scowling at you, and that tall, flat front end is just a very popular style on cars right now, sadly, because we know that causes problems. So just wrapping up this cars spiel. Another big problem is commercial vehicles. I just wanted to touch on this real briefly because these cause a disproportionate share of pedestrian and bike deaths. And this image shows the blind zones around one of these vehicles. All these areas shown in red are invisible to the driver. So we let these cars drive into our major cities like Manhattan, where there might be a bike lane here where 15 people could be waiting there, and they're totally invisible to the driver. And all of these blind zones could be basically resolved, could be eliminated with mirrors and cameras, but we haven't required companies to do that. Okay, so again, shifting gears, I'm just going to talk a little bit about solutions. You guys have probably almost all heard of this. If you're attending this is a road diet, an example of road diet. This is a really successful one. It shows Queens Boulevard in New York, which was called the Boulevard of Death locally. 189 people were killed on this road between 1996 and 2014. So multiple deaths every year. Maybe there was a half a dozen deaths a year on this single road or more. This actually is not that unusual. A lot of cities have maybe one road or a handful of roads that account for a wildly disproportionate share of deaths. But in 2014, New York got together $14 million and they did this road diet where they added a protected bike lane right here. They also added a protected bus lane over on the other side. And after that happened, immediately the deaths stopped happening. Since that occurred, I believe there's only been 1 or 2 deaths, which isn't, it's also sad that that occurred, but it's a huge, huge change, a huge improvement. Another thing New York is doing that's pretty effective is they're changing the way they time their traffic signals. They're using a tool called a leading pedestrian interval. So that all that means is that pedestrians who are crossing get a couple seconds head start on turning vehicles. So they have the walk signal just for a couple seconds all by themselves. So that way they can be out in the center of the intersection when these cars start turning and especially making left turns. Left turns are pretty dangerous. And they add these, they added these little barriers here. This is called a hardened center line. And that just forces cars to make these left turns at a little bit sharper angle and a little slower speed. And that has helped reduce pedestrian deaths in New York, like 40%, 35, 40%. And these are, I should add, these are really relatively inexpensive treatments. It only costs New York City about $1,200 to do an intersection with the leading pedestrian interval and the hardened center line. Okay, here's another success story I like to highlight. It's this, if I was there in the room with you, I'd ask you guys to guess what cities these are, but this is, because we're not, this up here at the top is Detroit, and this is where I live, Cleveland. And I think this was taken from space, but you can sort of notice that Detroit is a little bit bluer color and Cleveland is a little bit yellower. So in like 2013, 2012, Detroit did the survey of its streetlights, and it found out that about 40% of them were not working, had burnout or just weren't functioning. So they did something about it. They issued $185 million in bonds. And over these 2 years, 2014 to 2016, they replaced them with LED lights. They got them all functioning. And I just want to point out, this had a huge impact on pedestrian deaths. About 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night. And I think that streetlights are a little bit of an overlooked issue. And again, it sort of goes back to the privilege sometimes of the people who are in positions of influence, like maybe a lot of urban planners, I include myself in this, sort of are privileged enough that we can take for granted that the streetlights work in our neighborhood, but that's not the case for everyone. So when Detroit got these streetlights working, here, this chart is hard to read, but this blue portion here shows deaths occurring in dark, unlighted conditions. So Detroit was having about 25, 26 deaths a year in 2013, 2014, occurring in dark, unlighted conditions. After they finished this project, they went down to 1, and overall pedestrian deaths were down about 35%, just in a few years. Here's just an example I like. This was done in Baltimore. They had this really dangerous street. It was difficult to fix. There wasn't room for a sidewalk, or they didn't have the money. And instead of hemming and hawing and waiting a decade, they just put up these dividers and created a safe space out of a lane. I think that's cool, and more places should do that. Think of creative ways to make safe spaces. Here's another, I've been using Detroit as a good example. I think this is cool as well. They're planning to install speed humps all over the city. Very inexpensive, only $11.5 million. Okay, and I'm wrapping up now. We can get to questions, but this is another treatment I really like, and I think is pretty humble. It's called a pedestrian island or a pedestrian refuge island. And these only cost a few $1,000s to install. It sort of depends on the materials and that kind of thing, but this is a nice one. It's accessible by wheelchair. And the Federal Highway Administration recommends these. They say they reduce pedestrian fatalities about 35%. So I think we need some more treatments like this. These are, I think they're considered a little bit unsexy. And some of this stuff is getting streetlights working, making sure there's curb ramps in the right places. There's all these sort of missing pieces we need to keep pedestrians safe. And I think that in order to resolve the problem, we sort of have to go back to the streets we've already built and put them in place. So this is something that doesn't really take away any right of way from drivers. So it wouldn't cause like a typical war on cars type fight. Probably there probably wouldn't be much political pushback. It's just sort of a matter of resources and attention. And we just haven't, this issue has been sort of invisible. Again, I think because of the lower sort of status of the people who are put in the position of walking along dangerous roads for the most part. And yeah, so I think more attention to the problem would go a long way, and that the way we think about this problem in itself is a big part of the solution. So with that, just real quick plug for my book. If anyone does want to pick it up, you can find it at the publisher if you want, or you could buy it at a local bookstore, wherever. But if you do use this link at the bottom, you can have a 20% discount with this discount code. It's just my last name, Schmitt. And if you want to get a hold of me, that is how you do that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I think we're going to do questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angie. Managed to hurry and pedal home as you're presenting. That's wonderful. We have a lot of great questions here. We're going to start with just a couple of Provo specific ones. So with 15% walking to work daily, Provo has the highest rate of walking in any city over 20,000 people in the Intermountain West. However, pedestrian safety has largely been neglected here in favor of car thoroughfare and speed. So what can we as advocates do to show decision makers the importance of safe streets?
So I just want to be upfront that I know nothing about Provo, like at all. So one of the tools I like is called a pedestrian safety audit. And so that just means you're getting a few stakeholders together, especially like some important decision makers, but also, you know, whoever might be interested in doing walks along key corridors, especially you could probably map and find out what are the most dangerous locations. And because it's a very localized problem, different streets are sort of missing different elements. So that's one way I like to propose to address it. Those have a really good return on investment. It's like 10 to 1. But the other thing that I think people should do is a lot about how we respond when someone is killed. When someone is killed, if we blame them, if it's a 2-paragraph article in a newspaper and everyone forgets about it, then we won't resolve it. So sort of, I think we need to lift up the voices of people who have been harmed by this, and try to empower them to speak out for change also.
Fantastic. Grabbing from some of our attendees here. Where can you find ethnicity data for injury crashes? The police report I think that says 19, or DI-9, at least in Utah, has no racial information.
So I don't know about Utah, but there's a system that the federal government uses called FARS, Fatality Something Reporting System. And I believe they would have it. I don't know why they wouldn't have it for Utah. I would expect you can get it there, but I'm not 100% certain.
I'll just jump in. That was a question from Dan Bergenthal. UDOT has just completed kind of a demographic analysis going into the DI-9s confidentially, and looking at some of the ethnicity data, age data, gender data, and kind of use that to conduct the demographic analysis. So if anyone's interested, they can reach out to me, Heidi Goodhart at UDOT, and I'll pass on.
Awesome. Yeah, that's helpful if people can chime in that they know local stuff that I don't, because I don't know anything about Utah, unfortunately.
Seeing that Mary's maybe not answering the next question, I'll go ahead. Tom Millar has a question. Angie, you show that Wyoming is in the high PDI group, but this is a traffic fatalities are among the highest in the US, over 25 per 100,000. Do they just have high non-pedestrian fatalities? Can you respond to that?
So they actually on that map, they were one of the safer locations according to Smart Growth America, who they have a little formula that they use for this. I think it's just sort of a fluke. There's probably not a whole lot of walking that happens there, but I can't really explain Wyoming, that situation in Wyoming myself.
All right, I'll jump in with another. Thanks, Heidi. Sorry, we're just trading off here. We have an anonymous one. Highways are almost always built to 100% completion, yet there are still missing sidewalks in the urban parts of our city. How can we show decision makers this unequal treatment?
It really is hard. I mean, I don't think that so I think it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of squeaky wheels sort of advocating for that. And it may involve changes to formulas that are controlled at higher levels of government too. I don't think there's really an easy solution necessarily. I think, like I sort of said in the presentation, more attention to the problem is sort of where we would start with stuff like that. I mean, in some areas, I know that they've pursued local bond measures based exclusively or largely around sidewalk construction. And I do know of other places where they've tried to tie it more to developers and to try to make developers foot the cost more of sidewalks so they happen more automatically. But I don't think there's necessarily one easy trick to make that happen. But I agree, like there's missing pieces. I say that all the time when I do these presentations. On highways, everything you need to be safe is there. But on our local roads, if you're walking or using the bus, a lot of the pieces you need to be safe are missing.
Sorry, go ahead, Heidi.
Great. So the next one is from Theodore. How do American pedestrian deaths compare to nearby countries with somewhat similar driving cultures like Mexico, Canada, Central America? European cities tend to not prioritize cars over people, so I imagine their statistics are much different.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that that question. I'm always trying to get people interested in that. So in my book, I have a whole chapter about this that makes international comparisons and talks about the problem around the world. And this is an enormous problem in developing nations. They may have death rates that are many times ours, even though they have way, way fewer cars on their roads. But among wealthy nations, we are sort of an outlier for how bad we do on this. Canada, for example, has about half as many traffic fatalities per capita as we do. And Canada, again, is pretty similar context. I haven't ever looked at how Mexico's numbers compare to us, but I know that some of their policies are more progressive than ours. We are in the United States, we're out of the World Health Organization's, we don't comply with World Health Organization best practices across a range of issues, from drunk driving to speeding to seatbelt laws, that all kinds of nations, including middle income nations, do. Like Brazil and India will have stricter seatbelt laws, for example, or drunk driving laws than we do here in the United States. So we have this like really freewheeling cultural attitude about this, and a lot of people die unnecessarily because of it.
Thank you. From Judith, we have, I am curious about Angie's experience overcoming cultural roadblocks. For example, the lack of interest in the issue she mentioned. I would love to hear an example of how she was able to create interest for the topic.
So that's sort of like what all this is about, writing a book, going and doing talks about it. I'm hoping, raises a profile of the issue. And I think it does a little bit because no one's ever written a book about it before. I've been writing about this stuff for a long time, and that was always the goal. But obviously we're competing with all these other pressing issues, especially right now. So I don't think like traffic safety is the most important issue all the time, but I do think it's more important than it gets credit for. It doesn't get as much attention compared to the amount of harm that it causes. So I don't know. I'm sort of doing my best, but we and advocates are trying to raise their voices in various forums. And I think more and more people are interested in it all the time, but strong cultural headwinds. The auto industry is such a huge advertiser. That stuff has so much impact. Pop culture, race, car racing scenes from movies. That stuff has so much impact on the way we view these issues.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie. Our next question is from Glenn. Do you have any thoughts on how we can increase safety for impaired, so drunk or drugged pedestrians without victim shaming? We've noticed a fairly high prevalence of drugs and alcohol in our pedestrian fatalities.
Yeah. So I think we should make extra effort to make areas safe for walking, to make sure they're well lit, to make sure there's safe crossings, there's pedestrian refuge islands, whatever need may be around areas where there's a lot of drinking happening, and where there may be homeless populations congregating, or there might be concentrations of homeless people. Because not to imply that all homeless people are alcoholics or anything, but there is some evidence that homeless people are at increased risk. And so that's sort of one way. I don't know that we're going to sort of alcohol in our culture is a lot like cars, where it's just totally ubiquitous and there's a very freewheeling attitude about it. In some countries where they have much better traffic safety outcomes, like Sweden, they control alcohol sales more tightly. They may sell it at fewer locations, have higher taxes, and they have stronger cultural norms against drinking in some instances. But it's really difficult. Like I know that back in the Mothers Against Drunk Driving era, there was sort of a push. One of the proposals was to put an excise tax on alcohol, and then use the money to fund a free taxi service for people who were drinking. But that was sort of quashed by the alcohol industry back then. And so now we don't really have a lot of good solutions, I don't think. But yeah, I would say to the extent that like local issues that locals have control over, you do need to be thinking about, okay, where are people drinking and how can we make those areas safer for people to walk? Maybe control speed a little more.
Thank you so much. Okay, this one is similar to the one we asked before. We've got a lot of people really interested in kind of grassroots advocacy, which is what Bike Walk Provo is all about. But we have one comment from Soren about how where they live up in Salt Lake City, many of these policies have been pedestrian and bike friendly infrastructure and systems, but have been slow to be implemented. So I guess the question then is, what have you found to be the most effective ways for grassroots organizers to persuade elected and appointed officials to prioritize this kind of infrastructure?
So one of the things I talk about in my book is there's this group called Families for Safe Streets. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of that. That's sort of emerged. I get a lot into the details in New York City is where they first got started. And basically it's this organization of mostly parents, but also spouses and relatives of people who've been hit and killed by cars in New York. And they're sort of housed under Transportation Alternatives, which is the advocacy group in New York. but they've really helped push forward changes there. When you have someone like, there's a woman I write about in the book named Amy Cohen, and her 12-year-old son was killed by a driver. It became like sort of a crusade for her to try and prevent that happening to other people. And she was able to stand up at city council meetings, or eventually in Albany in the state capitol, and tell this really heart-rending rendering story about what she'd been through, and sort of help create a moral basis for change. So I think that that's I'm really excited about the potential for that. And one of the things they do, which I think is also, they fill this really needed void for people. If you lose a loved one this way, it's so traumatic and there's no support. Everyone just thinks they were sort of singled out by the universe, like a lightning bolt struck. And one thing they do is they provide supportive services, like they help connect them with counselors and provide sort of a shoulder to cry on. So I think that that's really cool and promising sort of development. And that if we could get more of the people who have, again, really suffered from this kind of thing personally, sort of having them more in the spotlight, I think that, and getting them engaged in these political battles, I think would be really helpful.
Thanks so much. There's a couple questions that are a little similar, so I'm going to merge a question from Spencer and Stephanie. If the city were wanting to make improvements, what are ineffective versus ineffective examples, and what improvements have kind of the highest value for their costs, like speed humps, lighting, center barriers, etc.
Yeah, one of the cheapest ones, I think, is this retiming traffic signals. A lot of times there may not be, the traffic signals are timed in a way that, I think the one time I mentioned Utah in the book was to criticize the way they time traffic signals, but they're sort of set up in an ableist way. And, so only a fit, middle-aged man can make it across the street in time. So those leading pedestrian intervals or just retiming traffic signals is relatively inexpensive and a good place to start. But some of this stuff, like I was in Pittsburgh last weekend and I noticed they had used bollards to create a little pedestrian islands. So they basically just set up, I wish I had the picture handy, but they just set up a little safe space in some bollards. Sorry. Another thing that I cite some research in the book that shows on narrower roads, you don't want to do this on like a 6-lane road, but on a narrower road, those little yellow signs, you know what I'm talking about, that stick right out of the ground and say, yield to pedestrians, state law. They get run over and need to be replaced every so often. So that's, some people are a little resistant to installing them for that reason, but there's some research that shows those are really very effective as well, for mid-block crossings especially.
Great, thank you so much, Angie. As with, here's a question from Erin. As with bicycling, when it comes to walking, is there safety in numbers that you found? If you reach a certain threshold, does that make walking safer for everyone?
So I don't know about just walking in groups. I would imagine walking in groups does help. But yeah, I do think like in cities that there is more walking, there's more political support for safe facilities, and it encourages more people to walk. So some of the cities that we've seen make the most progress are some of the cities that have the best conditions in the first place. I think it gets really difficult in places like Phoenix and Southern Florida, where most walking is so dangerous that hardly anyone is doing it, and the people who are doing it tend to be really poor, and maybe they're recent immigrants, and just oftentimes, have a lot of intersecting marginalized identities. It's much more difficult in those places to build the political will and the political capital for change, I think. But I don't know of studies that have looked at that in quite the same way as biking, I guess I would say.
Great. Here's a maybe a question, and some of the it's answered or asked in a couple places, and I think that this can maybe like get at the heart of a lot of work behind advocacy organizations and just the people that are out doing this work. How do you keep up your fight against our unhealthy car-centric culture? It can be very discouraging. And are you optimistic that the forces of good can prevail?
Yeah, so I see signs of, it's frustrating because obviously a lot of negative things have happened in the last decade with car design and some other issues, even like Uber. It's frustrating how much Uber has added cars in some of the most walkable cities in the United States. But I think things are starting to change a little bit. I see things that are encouraging, like even in suburban areas, like around here in Ohio, the design of big box shopping centers. I know that that's not very sexy, but like they redid one in a suburb here, and it's not even a very fancy suburb. And they really made an effort to make it, they have businesses that front the street now. They do that row of businesses, and they made an effort to make it a little bit more sustainable with the green infrastructure and a little bit more walkable, less terrible. So you see that kind of thing changing slowly around here. I mean, the city of Cleveland, who was, we thought, I've been involved with advocacy for a decade now. And we thought that the city of Cleveland is so terrible, and the engineer is just such a knucklehead. And we still get frustrated with them, of course, but now I see some projects they've done, and they're adding these nice mid-block crossings, and I'm like, hey, I like this. I think one of the problems for advocacy and sort of where we've gone wrong is, not building a big enough tent. We need to bring more people sort of in, and we need to form alliances with groups where we feel like there's some common ground, and that might mean supporting them on issues that are important to them as well, to try and build a bigger coalition. So I think we need to do that. And we also need to think about where, when improvements do occur, are they happening in a way that's equitable? If they're just going to areas that are higher income, whiter areas, they aren't going to have the kind of safety benefit they would if they were in areas where people were more dependent on walking, and where improvements are so needed.
Thank you so much, Angie. That is so helpful for us to bear in mind. We are at the end of our hour with Angie. We're so grateful for her taking the time to meet with us. We wanted to be sure to encourage you to check out her book. There is a discount code webinar for 30% off at Island Press. I'm going to go ahead and put in the link to that book. You can go ahead and put your email address in the chat if you want to do a group book purchase to save with us, to save on shipping costs, and we can pedal deliver to you here in Provo.
That's awesome.
So go ahead and add your email, or you can email us as well. Let's see.
Well, I want to say thank you so much. And good luck.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Angie. We're really happy to have you and host you, and we really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
And Angie also can be hired through her new planning firm, 3 MPH planning. So those of you who are in that business, be sure to check her out.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right, we'll go ahead and end.